Well, thank you so much, Kristin, for being with me today on the WaveCapital's guest speaker series on relationship building in a team environment. You're my 86th guest. How are you today, Kristin?
Hey, Garrett, I'm well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on. 86 guests is a lot, so appreciate the work and thanks for reaching out.
Absolutely great to connect, and thank you so much for your time today. You've had amazing positions in the Democratic Party. You started out after a couple of positions that were non-political related, but you started your political career as the press secretary for U.S. Senator Michael Bennet, a Democrat from Colorado. You were the press secretary for Mark Udall for his campaign, Udall for Colorado. You were communications director for Representative Jared Polis at the time, who's now Governor Polis of Colorado. You were communications director for Hillary for America when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was running for president in 2016. You were then National Press Secretary for U.S. Senator Cory Booker, who is the U.S. Senator from New Jersey. I was born in northern New Jersey in Hackensack, so I do like Cory Booker. I admire him a lot and his political skill. And you were then his communications director for Senator Booker. And then you were senior advisor for communications for him as well. Then you started your company. You are the founder and principal of KCL Strategies. And then you just relaunched it in July of last year. But in that process, in between, you were senior advisor for U.S. Senator John Hickenlooper, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And most recently, you were special assistant to President Biden and the chief speechwriter to Dr. Jill Biden, our First Lady of 2021 to 2025. But you were in that position specifically from August of 2023 to June 2024, and then you relaunched KCL Strategies in July of this year. So my question to you, and I ask all my guests, is Kristin, when you think of relationship building in a team environment, what does relationship building mean to you? And what is it meant for your professional career?
Yeah, I think actually I'm reminded of something Senator Booker would say often, which is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I feel like the relationships have been really like the foundation of my career. I come from like I come from I'm a big sports fan. I can tell it seems like you are as well, at least when it comes to football. And I played sports growing up, and there was just something about the thing I'm drawn to is like the teamwork and the team atmosphere and sort of this concept that like the sum of all parts is often greater than like the individual value of any one part. And it's why like we love the underdog teams, right? Because it's not so much that they have all these stars, it's more that like for whatever reason they work well together and they're able to accomplish extraordinary things. So I say that all of just I feel like I maybe didn't realize this at 21 or 22 when I was starting out my career, but as I look in the rear view window from like an interesting vantage point now, having like still having some many years left in my career, but having been doing this stuff for 15 or 20 years, that's just so salient, I guess, the how important the relationships are, and I think in politics specifically and in DC, and I'm like a Southern California kid, like, when I grew up, I was, like, nerding out and watching C-SPAN at home 3 on the West Coast time, and, like, it was, like, a totally different universe, and I remember being on the outside of that universe and trying so hard to break in, and, of course, not having any relationships because nobody I knew worked in this industry when I was very young, and then finally you get your first break, which for me happened with, Senator Bennett's office, and then you get another break, and then you realize, "Whoa, I'm, like, now in the universe, and all these relationships I'm making are going like, you're not thinking this at the time because this isn't about transaction, this is about, like, working together to achieve a common good, but then you realize, like, so and so that you worked with 4 years ago is now here, and they need someone, and they're looking for someone, and it just ends up sort of having, like, a bit of a domino effect there.
Yes, absolutely. And you talk about your upbringing in Southern California and that you would watch C-SPAN growing up and you took a real interest, a genuine interest in politics at the federal level. Were you drawn particularly to local politics in Southern California? What was your inspiration? Who did you look to for mentorship or role models? What drew you to the national political landscape? And what was your inspiration?
Yeah, a couple things like are like stand out in my mind. One, I was this is dating myself now, but I was a senior in high school when the 2001 Bush Gore election happened. And I did not realize, like, when you're growing up, I don't think I was talking politics with my dad at the dinner table, but I wasn't thinking, like, do I live in a conservative or a Democrat or a liberal place, right? I was just sort of living my life. And I remember we did like a fake election at my high school in Orange County, California. And now, of course, Orange County is a bastion of conservatism inside California. It's an interesting type of conservatism because it's sort of leaning blue, leaning blue more than it was 10 years ago, and certainly more than it was 25 years ago when I was there. But I remember we did like a straw poll, and it was just I was like, my parents are like blue collar working class Democrats. Like my dad grew up on the south side of Chicago. Like his parents are immigrants. Like I've always been a Democrat because by blood, I suppose. And I just thought everyone believes in that. And then we did like a straw poll with all the high school kids, and it was 96 to 4, 96% George Bush, 4% for Gore. And I was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize I'm like sort of the black sheep. And that was kind of the first time I started. Again, I was always interested in like following the current events, but I never thought about how it like impacted my day to day. And I certainly never thought that there were like careers in this. So that was definitely and I remember that night in particular. And we were on West Coast time, so like all of the stuff that was happening at like midnight or 1 a.m. here in DC was at that, happening at like 10 or 11. I was trying to stay up. My dad let me stay up late that night. I remember I was taping. I think I have the tape somewhere because it was back when you could like tape VHS like when a show was on or something. So I just
Sure.
knew that that was like a cool moment and I wanted to like capture it for posterity. So that stands out as like the first time I was like, "Oh, this is like I'm pretty passionate about this. This is maybe like a little bit more than like your average, 17-year-old." And then the other thing is I should give a shout out to LULAC, which is the League of Latin American Scholars, I believe, League of United Latin American Citizens, excuse me. They have a scholarship program, and they gave me a little bit of money for college. And I think as a junior or senior, I would go. Loretta Sanchez is a congresswoman who represents Orange County, and they would have like a dinner every year that I would go to, and that was like my other like I sort of looked up to her as like the one member of Congress that I was like familiar with, and she didn't represent exactly because Orange County is sort of cut and diced into a few different slices. But that was the second little taste of being like, oh, there's like a whole world. There's like someone that is here in Orange County at this scholarship dinner, and yet she works in Washington D.C. in this place I'm kind of intrigued about. So I guess that was like another sort of formative moment when I think back on like how I got interested in this world, if you will.
Absolutely. And, people tend to think California being majority blue, which it is.
Yep.
It's different than it was during Ronald Reagan's time or even Richard Nixon's time when you can have Republicans and be elected to the presidency from the state of California, and
Yeah.
also President Reagan being a former governor of California. When I think about your upbringing, and I've been to California many times, my wife works for a Silicon Valley-based company, but she has a territory in sales and medical devices here in the Orlando area. But I have family who live right outside of LA. My wife has some family in Orange County and San Clemente through her mom's side. But I was in California, and I'd been to California many times in my previous role as the managing partner and chief development officer of WaveCapital Partners, which I named my podcast after. And a lot of clients out there love the way Californians do business out there. Very comparable, I would say, but in different respects to, being that I'm originally from the Northeast and knowing how New York City, in terms of, Wall Street minded people operate and just businessmen and women up in New York is very fast paced. California, similar to Chicago and other places, a more of a relaxed pace, but California still is similar in the sense that no, they're workers, they're ready to go. They don't let
Yeah.
grass grow under their feet. They're innovative, they're
Yeah.
outside the box thinkers. They're very direct and targeted in terms of like what they want to accomplish and what they want to achieve. And I enjoyed representing clients out there. And the
Mm.
point I'm trying to make is you growing up in Orange County, you quickly learned even in the time you were growing up, that, "Oh, I thought California was mostly blue," but you happened to grow up in the
Mhm.
Republican or conservative enclave,
Totally.
one of them,
Yep.
which is Orange County. So I love the fact that you knowing your true roots of being a Democrat, that although that you were in Orange County, it didn't dissuade you or it didn't deter you in any way to say, you know what, although I'm in a more conservative county, I know who I am as a Democrat. And if I'm going to get into politics, let's say, I'm going to
Mhm.
just, follow where my true beliefs and passions are, while still respecting obviously the other side of the aisle and having
Like,
colleagues and working with counterparts, on the conservative Republican side. But once you got into your political career, which one of those positions, as I mentioned in the opening, would you say were really pivotal that where and you referenced, Senator Cory Booker, but then you got to work with President Biden and First
yeah.
Lady Dr. Jill Biden and others. So which one
Yeah.
would you say would be the more or most pivotal moment, you would say?
Oh man, it's so it that it's hard to. It's like I don't have kids, but I imagine choosing from your kid, trying to pick the most. So I'll give you two, which is kind of a cop out, but like the first, I remember my first break was getting in being Michael Bennett's press secretary, and that was like I was just so green. I enjoyed writing and I enjoyed politics, and I think I had the base skills to be effective in that position. But looking back, I mean, I know there was a point where my boss who sat next to me was very early, it was election season and she was mentioning GOTV and I was like, what's GOTV stand out, which is get out the vote, which is a very like, if you work in our industry, you know that. And so I was so wet behind the ears and like, um, I don't know, I am so grateful because if I hadn't gotten that, I would have just taken another path and it probably wouldn't have been into politics. So I really appreciate like that office for taking a chance on me, for sort of seeing that I had the skills, even though I needed a little bit more training in this like world. Right. And then it's really hard to not. I mean, my last year at the White House, it was just like a true pinnacle. Like I never would have thought a million years when I was staying up in November of 2001, just glued to the TV, that in however many years I would be like walking in the corridors of the West Wing, right? And flying on Air Force One and Air Force Two and working closely with the First Lady on her remarks. Like that I would have been like, that's crazy. I wouldn't even known that was like a possibility. So it's really hard. And it was brief, and these jobs always are like they move fast and they're intense and it. Like I knew I was so lucky to do what I was doing, to be able to like write and have a platform and like promote ideas that I believed in and that I was passionate about and try to persuade. I knew every day that I was lucky and that it also was going to end at some point. And so there's no regret, right? I feel like I ran through the ticker tape, but it's sad because nobody's working in the White House for. I mean, some are working in the White House, I guess, all 4 years, 8 years, but I think that's rare. And you sort of run your leg of the mile or the sprint or whatever, and then you pass the baton. But those are the two, I think, I guess, bookends really. My first one, my first shot, and then the finale. And I'm at we'll see what comes next. I hope we'll see where the river takes me. Obviously, not a great environment to be a Dem staffer now, but politics changes, and I feel just like I hope the next 20 years have been as exciting as the last one. But yeah, last 20. But yeah, that's that. Sorry, that was all over the place. But I'm used to writing it out for people, not answering all the questions. So
No, that's great. And, I have a journalism and mass communication background. I went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, got a degree in journalism and mass communication. Now our school is the UNC Husband School of Journalism and Media. And I am a journalist at heart. I love reporting. I love writing. I love news gathering. And so I have a great appreciation for what you do, being that you have held a press secretary role before and also been in a position where chief speechwriter for Dr. Jill Biden, being a special assistant to President Biden. So I definitely want to talk to you about your most recent experiences, but I'm glad that you touched upon your previous ones and being originally from the state of New Jersey. And as I mentioned, I really like Cory Booker. I love his platform. I love what he stands for. Very logical. I love the way he communicates his messages. And, he's definitely a rising star, if not already. And I believe that, in my opinion, I could see him as a potential, 2028 presidential candidate or maybe a vice presidential candidate. I know that from your home state of California, I'm also a big fan of Governor Gavin Newsom, and I believe that, he showed that loyalty to President Biden, Vice President Harris, in the sense of knowing that, he wanted to see, in my opinion, where the campaign was heading. First it was President Biden running for reelection, and then it was handed off to Vice President Harris. And although sadly she lost the election, and
Yep.
I was rooting for her, I was rooting for President Biden to win the election. I now see an opportunity for maybe a Gavin Newsom to run for president. And I also think about, well, if the U.S. House of Representatives, if there's a blue wave next year, which if you look at the polling with President Trump and just the sentiment, amongst congressional members and really the Republican Party, I'm starting to see their backs are against the wall. They're on their heels because the big beautiful bill wasn't that big and beautiful and it wasn't that popular. But I think that if there's a blue wave next year and if Gavin Newsom or whomever. It could be Jared Polis, who you worked for in the past when he was a U.S. House representative. Maybe we see Josh Shapiro. There's Gretchen
Mhm,
Whitmer. There's Wes Moore.
mhm,
The list
mhm.
goes on and on. But if it is a Gavin Newsom, being from the state of California, let's say from your home state, would love to get your opinions on that. As a vice presidential candidate, I mean, maybe Wes Moore, maybe Cory Booker. I believe that Hakeem Jeffries will be our next Speaker of the House. I think the polling shows that. I think that we just saw it in the Democratic Party in a special election. A seat was picked up in Virginia, a
Yep,
Democrat in
yep.
Virginia. So would love to get your opinions on, maybe Cory Booker's future having worked for him and being from the home state of California. What your thoughts are on Governor Newsom?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working for Corey. I worked for Corey since 2017 for 3 plus years, and obviously I've remained in touch with his office and his staff and all my friends and alumni since then. I mean, I was disappointed he didn't catch more fire, on the campaign in 2020. I was working or 2019. I was working in the Senate office and obviously holding down the fort while he was out on the road. I think he's got a lot to offer. I mean, we talk. I think especially he's just a genuinely good person and I would love to get back a little bit. We talk about sort of this desire for like, more civility and more respect in our public conversations, our public discourse. And he's certainly a guy that I think embodies that. So I think his future is bright. And I hope, he's got a great perch here in the US Senate. His constituents love him from New Jersey. He's able to kind of be in the mix and I guess see what might develop in the next few years. I have, since I've moved away from California politics, it's like, as I understand, is like its own thing. And so it's hard for me. I haven't honestly watched Gavin Newsom too. I mean, I haven't analyzed it as much as maybe I had
Sure.
other presidential candidates. I think the thing governors off I feel like governors have a great like platform, right? They're able to kind of rail against DC. They're sort of insider, but they're not insider. As opposed to someone in the Senate who's kind of maybe part of the problem, or there's like a that's a very attractive platform to say like, hey, those guys in DC don't know what's going on. I represent my state. I'm an executive, and this is what we've been able to do. That I've found that the transition can be a bit jarring, especially on the campaign. I remember the 29 campaign. The spotlight when you are a federal lawmaker, I think, is much brighter than it is when you're like a state lawmaker. And I think sometimes it shows people's like true colors, if you will, as they are under pressure, like every day with a microphone in their face or a camera in their face, right? Which is how it is often on the Hill when you've got beat reporters constantly in the halls of Congress trying to chase down leads. That's not necessarily how it is for governors. But I'm saying that because I think California is a different beast. Like that spotlight is shiny and bright and there's a high level of scrutiny and he seems to have really like stepped into that and handled that really well. And I know he's drawn a lot of praise for the social media game and sort of embracing some Trumpian tactics. So if you had told me who was gonna I had no idea. I did not think that that the 2019 nominee party would turn the nomination fight would turn out as it did. And I think that means I need to get out of like the business of predictions because anything can happen. I think remember at this point ahead of the 2020 cycle, like Beto O'Rourke was seen as like the savior and was gonna win, and he flamed out fairly quickly. So I think, yeah, we set our sights in the next 2 years for hoping, making, hopefully flipping the house, and then it's anyone's game, which is a really may the best person win, may the best campaign win, may the best ideas prevail.
Of course, and I love the way that you explained all that, and it's true. I remember Beto O'Rourke, he was seen as somebody who probably could propel himself as the front runner, and it didn't work out for him.
Yeah.
And to know that when Kamala Harris, she was one of the, Democratic, candidates. And
Yeah.
thankfully, President Biden chose her. I thought she was a wonderful vice president. And also, she is from the state of California too. So, want to get your thoughts on the last election, any surprises or any thoughts, what the Democrats could have done differently. I've talked to other guests of mine who were involved in the campaign last year, and just want to get your thoughts on that, and also just your experiences working with President Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, and being President Biden's special assistant and being Dr. Biden's chief speechwriter.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of want to get out of the like looking back and mistakes that were made. I think they're probably, in hindsight, I think it maybe is clear that him running was probably not the best decision, and it would have been much better to have maybe like sort of an open primary many long before July of 2024. I think the vice president was in a very tough spot, and her team, I mean, however many, I think it's the title of her memoir, but however many
107 days, the shortest presidential campaign in modern US history.
yeah, it's just I think they did the best with what they got, and not what they got being Kamala, just the cards that were dealt. She was a loyal vice president, as that's the job of the vice president. It's why some people pass on it and some people do. Actually, like my favorite quote from LBJ is I mean, this is morbid, and I actually yeah, he ended up taking, he did not want to be Kennedy's vice president, but the up to that point an unusually high number of presidents had died while in office, and he was playing the odds, which were, there is a decent chance that something will happen and I will be president. And sure enough, he made that happen. I mean, it was as tragic as that was. So I say that more. Nobody wants to be vice president. Everyone wants to be president. And I think we saw the challenge of when vice president was now at the top of the ticket, Vice President Harris. She had to, on the one hand, remain loyal to the person who had gotten her there, and yet also try to carve out a distinct path, and it just obviously was not tenable. And I think that the a bigger lesson is that I do think it's easy in this DC bubble to the groupthink, the echo chamber, to forget what every person outside of DC is feeling, right? And I think people had made it clear that they were feeling that President Biden was too old. And I think the lesson here is like we need to not give shortchange those opinions. And if like polling and anecdotal feedback and focus groups is saying one thing, we should listen to them and go with them, because I think we tried as a party to say it's okay, he's really not old, you're just seeing all these things, and it's right or not, it's like what the Americans are feeling, and we have to, if we do represent the most people, the everyday normal blue collar person, the college educated person, we've got to, like, I think, take more heed to what those folks are saying. In terms of, you asked about my time with Dr. Biden, it wasn't, yeah, the cool thing about being the chief speechwriter is there's obviously like a lot, I don't want to say one-on-one time because it was like a team effort, but you do see that them, or I saw Dr. Biden in more, I don't, intimate is the wrong word, but just away from the cameras, right? Like when we're working on a speech on Air Force Two, or at lunch when we're on the road or something like that. And that is like that is exciting. And she is a normal person like any of the rest. She was teaching while she was first lady. She was incredibly down to earth, incredibly kind. And it was it was nice to see, to have this idea of the first lady and then get to know her on like a different basis. And again, it wasn't very much a team, like, she's got a senior staff that was in place, and I worked closely with that senior staff on the remarks and stuff like that, so I don't wanna give the impression it was just me and her walking alone in the woods, but, it was a cool thing to be a part of, and yeah, it was a nice, I suppose, perk of some of these difficult and challenging jobs.
Yes, of course, and I would imagine the same goes for, working with President Biden and being a special assistant for him. I guess it was par for the course that you get to be with President Biden, but you're really amongst a team of people who are working with him and probably not necessarily one-on-one.
Yeah, if exactly, and the president's staff is so much larger that it rarely is like, and because I was technically on the first lady's team, it wasn't like there were moments where I was, like, briefing the president or anything like that, but I kinda like it a little, I being a woman and being sort of a strong feminist, it was exciting to be in the first lady's staff, and, not that there were, like, teams or anything, but I felt, everyone looks at the president, but we do treat our first ladies a little bit different. We treat them not as like harsh political figures, but sort of as people that can unite and speak across the aisle. And they try not to be, they try to be the first lady for everyone. And I think that is a very cool platform that our first ladies have that is different than like a US senator or a governor or just your straight up elected official. And I think that's why it was also such a cool opportunity because I think when Republicans and Democrats are listening to their first lady, they're not listening with like the jaded cynicism they may have if they're listening to like a president of the opposing party or like sort of the hard brass sort of thoughts they have when they're just looking on a straight up political figure.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, they serve a role as the spouse of the president, and then if you talk about the second lady, or in Doug Emhoff's case, Vice President, Kamala Harris's husband, obviously in life, but in that role from 2021 to 2025, that was historic as well. And when I interviewed Aaron Bennett, and his episode on my podcast will be airing in the next few weeks, he talked about similar scenarios as you have explained to me because he was the main speechwriter, or one of the main speechwriters for Nancy Pelosi when she was Speaker of the House. And so he had a lot of experience working with her, but in a team environment where it's not necessarily one on one.
Yep.
I mean, at times he was speaking with her one on one, but he would also have a lot of people who would be helping him on a team, I think he said, of 11 or 12 people. So everybody's input matters, everybody's contributing to the
Yep.
overall success of the speech. Obviously, he worked his way up to having more senior roles where his input was definitely visible. But at the end
Mhm.
of the day, I mean, it's still a Nancy Pelosi speech, but he got to
Yeah.
contribute in a significant fashion amongst other team members on his team and the team with Nancy Pelosi. When I think of, you mentioned, political discourse and, sadly, tragically, the other day, conservative activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Utah. And thankfully, this morning, the FBI, working with local authorities, state authorities in Utah, the governor of Utah, Governor Cox, talked about how they apprehended and brought into custody Tyler Robinson, 22-year-old from Utah, who assassinated Charlie Kirk. We've seen this tragically happen, these
Yeah.
heinous, deplorable crimes. We've
Yeah.
seen this happen not just on the Republican side, we've also seen on the Democratic side. You know, whether it was, Gabby Giffords, and there was Steve Scalise,
Mhm.
the Democratic lawmaker, earlier this year in Minnesota, where her husband was killed and their family dog was so terrible, so tragic. He happened to be a UNC Chapel graduate. I remember reading it in the UNC alumni magazine, and I'm a Chapel graduate, so that definitely struck a chord with me. And then you had two other individuals, one being another Democratic lawmaker, and his wife thankfully survived the shooting, but they had sustained injuries, and definitely a whole ordeal. We've heard about shootings at schools and synagogues and churches and
Yeah.
in public spaces, even going back to Columbine and Virginia Tech, when we were younger people. So we've seen violence of all types, and that includes political violence. And because we had talked offline that what happened with Charlie Kirk is reminiscent of things that we saw in the 60s with MLK and Malcolm X, RFK, JFK. But then the distinction of him not being elected official, although a surrogate in a significant way to the Make America Great Again movement and being one of President Trump's right-handed people, somebody who had a direct line to the presidency in terms of, phoning President Trump and whatnot. But where could we go as a country to make sure we're healing, to make sure we're being heard and listened to as a society where all ideas are welcomed, whether in schools or place of worship or workplaces, at home, where can we go? And being that you have had a career in politics and you continue to have a career in politics, although you have your own firm now, would love to hear what your future plans are in politics, back in the public sector, what your aspirations are with all the years of experience. But I interned on Capitol Hill many years ago, but that is my only official political experience interning for a U.S. Congressman from North Carolina at the time, Brad Miller, who was in the 13th District of North Carolina before gerrymandering took effect. But I'd interned for him for about 4 months or so. So unlike me, you have many years of experience in politics formally. So what type of conversations have you heard on the Hill, or what type of conversations did you hear in the White House that you could share that would be public knowledge where maybe citizens like us who are not working in the government, but citizens like you who have worked in the government, what are things that maybe the media is not covering? Or what are things that, although with the 24 hours, 7 days a week news coverage that can get on TV or on our phones or whatnot, but what are things that we're not hearing that you've heard where action is discussed, but it's hard to implement because of the division that we're facing today? And being that you have been a speechwriter because you have been in a press secretary role, would love to just get your expertise on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's very tragic, and did not agree with most slash any of Charlie's viewpoints, but obviously, just like, nope, that's so far beyond who we are. It's very disturbing, and like you said, like just even this summer, I mean, the Melissa Hortman in Minnesota, and then the two Jewish Israeli embassy staffers that were gunned down back in
That's correct.
May. I think you had the peaceful demonstrators in Boulder, Colorado, with the Molotov cocktail. It just and even the assassination of that healthcare executive last year. I mean, it just one thing from working inside sort of these places is I look, the media, they like conflict. That's helpful, right? To have Dems versus Republicans, to have pundits arguing with each other, to have US senators going at it. And while a little, I think what is sometimes worrying is that that does happen, but we also have relationships across the aisle, like when I was working with Senator Hickenlooper, there were things that Hickenlooper was doing with the Republican senator, like bills they were working on. Same thing with Senator Booker. I was a part of the Senate Press Secretaries Association, which is half Democrats and half Republicans, and we would go on trips to, New York to meet with producers and just learn a little bit more from the journalism side. And those would be, you would get to know Republican staffers because yes, on some things you're diametrically opposed. On other things, there might be common ground. And unfortunately, that's not good. Like common ground and peace and civility is not good TV. But the danger, I think, is I'm not so upset that I'm going to go get a gun and shoot someone, but it's clear that there are Americans who have been riled up in this way and then resort to violence. And I think that's the scary Rubik's cube that we have to solve of like, obviously there are mental health investments. We need to like make sure that guns are just less available. But I don't know. I mean, that's the $60 million question, right? Is like, why do most people understand conflict, and it can be like, I vehemently disagree. I'm very upset with that person. I'm not going to go the extra step and actually murder him. This isn't a game, right? That guy was a father and a husband, and now he's no more. So I don't know. It's very. I wish I had. I wish I had better answers. It's very tragic, and especially just as we were talking before, the podcast of just the way news is dispersed these days and images is, I think, also very disturbing. Not just how graphic that scene was, but I also just was reading how like the casings had like engraved sayings on them. And it's hard to imagine that he came up with that on him by himself, right? That clearly is like he saw that from the United Healthcare CEO death and picked that up. And I think one of the downsides of living in this day and age is like information is so readily accessible. I mean, it's at our fingertips, but it also means that copycats do have every detail that they want to sort of replicate the fantasies of violence they have. And that's a dangerous thing. I think we started seeing that with Columbine with like people that were mentally unstable were trying to replicate these things that they had seen because the images had been blasted everywhere.
It's really interesting that you say all that, and I agree with what you're saying completely. And, I've heard politicians say that we are actually more united than divided.
Yeah.
However, because of the media, and I am a part of the media through my podcast, but I've been interviewed on cable network television, local news stations, digital platforms. My work's been published, in article forms and article formats. And having my journalism background from a top school, like I was taught by my professors, you always have at least two verified sources. Obviously, we're in the business, or you're going in the business, our professors would say is, being always factual. Stay away from anything that's entertainment related. There's nothing wrong with entertainment news, but if you're in the business of
Yeah.
news, not
Yeah.
sports, and you're in the business of news, it's more news and less entertainment. And we live in a society where some networks more than others, Fox News is more sensational type of journalism, where CNN, and I watch a lot of networks, but CNN is more, I find to be more balanced because you have Democrats and Republicans on a much wider scale giving their opinions. And I feel that MSNBC is a little bit like CNN. There's more, and I agree with my other guests who have mentioned MSNBC, that it could show more of a partisan lens or toward the Democratic side. But I watch MSNBC and I still feel that it's still journalism.
Yeah.
Fox News, has been in litigation. They've been sued for, multiple reasons. And it always stems from something that was said or something that was put forth that they had to walk back, and every network has had to walk back information. I mean, MSNBC, commentator the other day, analyst lost his job because of things that were perceived by many people and felt the pressure that MSNBC had to let him go. And I agree that he should have not made it, and I know that probably his intention was not to make it political, but
Yeah.
he alluded to the fact that things that Charlie Kirk said is probably how all that unfolded. Instead of, he should have just said thoughts and prayers, and he should have just kept the politics out of it. But that goes to everybody having these sensitivities, and rightfully so, because in raw emotional times when things first happen, you don't want it to be where people go right to the politics. You got to think of the human first. And I totally
Yeah.
believe it. Think of the human element first.
Yeah.
And, you know, just talking to you, we have to certainly get to a better place with our discourse. And I feel that where Democrats, they want to focus on, okay, we got to get the guns off the streets. We have to make sure that people don't have access to guns. And then the Republican side of things is people who are killing people. It's not the guns that are killing people. However, the Democrats will say, but the guns are getting in the hands of people to use those weapons to kill people. So
Yeah.
it's two arguments, right? It's a mental health argument, and it's, the accessibility of guns. And there are
Yeah.
more guns than Americans in this country. So
Yeah.
why we can't come up with bipartisan legislation, and President Biden had that piece of legislation in 2022, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Yeah.
And that was the strictest piece of crime related reform legislation in nearly 30 years. And I would have hoped that at some point that could even be extended or expanded more because even President Biden was saying that, this is a great start, but we need to go further. And so we need our congressional members to act. And so my question to you is, in your opinion, why are congressional members falling short to bridge that divide, to quell that division, and try to not be tempted to care about how media is portraying Capitol Hill and just to do your jobs?
Yeah, and it's I have a lot of friends back in Colorado who are not in politics, and many of them were texting me yesterday just totally, like, just outraged and disturbed by what's been happening, and I do think I think most Americans want it's not like either or, I think most Americans want both and, right? And, like, unfortunately, the way that our electoral system has been structured, it's lend itself to the most extreme elements of both parties. I mean, there are very few moderate Republicans that would maybe even sign on to a strong gun safety bill, right? That those Republicans are long gone, and same for the Democrats, the Heidi Heidkamps and the Kay Hagans. I mean, those folks are gone for a while. So I think when you have such now polar opposites, it just makes it very difficult to find common ground. And it's I don't the primary system is built to support candidates that often are on the most extreme wings of the party, which just means they're going to be even further than finding that common ground. But the positive part of that is they are the candidates that have the most grassroots support, right, from the party, which is in theory what you want. So it just is a true, like, Gordian knot. And also, whenever we talk about this issue, it's hard not to think back to, I think it was 2012, a dozen kindergarteners, in the Sandy Hook, right? And you would have thought that, like, as a country, when we have 5-year-olds getting shot, that would be the impetus for fixing something. And remember, we got close. I think it was a Manchin Toomey bill, but it fell short because, again, like, the power of the NRA, the power of the loudness, and the cynic in me is worried that if that couldn't move the needle, I mean, that's the horrific that these kindergartners, and as we know with the earlier obviously the shooting at Evergreen High School in Colorado that day, earlier this week, and then you had the shooting at the Catholic school in Minnesota. I mean, it just is it's political violence, and it's also just everyday gun violence, and we've gotta put a stop to it.
Do you think there'll ever be a time where we reinstitute the assault weapons ban that was in place from 1994 to 2004, that really President Bill Clinton and then Senator at the time, US Senator Joe Biden, was instrumental as well to get that through. And, you know, I hope that we can get to a place
Yeah,
in society where Congress has the spines, or
yeah,
congressional members have the spines to just try to find the votes to be able to get another assault weapons ban in place, and that whomever is president, I know it's a long shot with President Trump because of the platform of having constituents of his, or voters of his, who are very much, pro Second Amendment, right to bear arms,
yeah,
tied to the NRA. However, there were Republicans back then too who believed in the right to bear arms. And really, all Democrats, Republicans, Independents believe in the Second Amendment in various degrees, because there are Democrats who are gun owners, there are independents who are gun owners, and there are Republicans who are gun owners. I think it's just to the level of degree of, okay, if you're a responsible gun owner, that's great. And if you want to protect your home, your assets, and if someone has a right to carry, that they're able to, depending on what state they live in, to protect themselves even when they're away from their home.
yeah,
There are different laws, right? Locally, state, and federal. But in terms of the fact that as a society, because when you then factor in mental health, and when you do factor in, there's a lot of guns that are illegally on the streets that are not registered, and that could get in the hands of people like the person, Tyler Robinson, who assassinated Charlie Kirk. And then you had mentioned all the other examples that we've seen in recent times.
yeah,
I'm saying to myself, every Democrat, every Republican, every independent knows what it's like to either be married, or even if you're single, you might not have kids, or maybe you do have kids, but you're not, if you've gone through a divorce or whatever your personal circumstances are, you still may be an uncle, an aunt, a godparent, have cousins, have friends who are parents. I mean, like, we're all a part of society where we don't want to see innocent people in our family or in our communities, in our cities, states, and across the country. We don't want to see anybody get hurt or killed. So I'm saying to myself, what is it about our congressional members where they can't have one or two people just lead the charge to write up a bill, try to caucus and get the votes, and then bring it to the House floor, pass it, then bring it to the Senate, pass it, have the president sign it. But again, that's all, academic, right? You have to still implement that in person. And because you've been in those circles, I also want to talk about what piece of legislation, and that could be my second question. What piece of legislation did you work on or a part of in the time that you've been in politics that you are most prideful of, that you feel like, wow, we're really heading down the right road. We're going down the right path because the things that have been implemented I've worked on, in your case, you're really most proud of it. But to answer the first question, why do you think it is still so hard to implement now more than ever?
I mean, I think the Republican Party doesn't agree that it's a gun safety issue, right? I don't think they feel, and I mean, I know you have some Republican guests on this, so it should be put because at the end of the day, like Dems don't control. We have no levers of power, and when we did have levers of power, we didn't have enough to break a filibuster, and so it's hard to pass. It's hard to get stuff done in Congress, right? You need a certain amount of votes, and you either have the votes or you don't. And at this point, I think it's gonna be, I mean, the last time I think Dems had a filibuster-proof majority was back in 2009, if I'm not mistaken, before Scott Brown won in 2010, and that, we focused on the Affordable Care Act, which was an important priority and has, very, very much helped, healthcare in this country and fix the broken system. So, it's a number. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a numbers game, and like people, there are people that vote on this issue exclusively, and most of those people are pro Second Amendment people, and they're not going to vote for any Republican that places one iota of like restrictions on guns. And unfortunately, we don't have enough, I think, Democratic voters who are just voting on that one issue. We might get to the point where it's such a pervasive problem that people are just voting on that one issue no matter what, and we can have the corollary. But at this point, it's a numbers game. You had mentioned legislation. I didn't work on a ton of, yeah, I didn't work on much gun safety legislation when I was in the Senate. I think two massive pieces that I was involved in that aren't gun related, but I guess I'm particularly proud of were at Treasury. I started at Treasury like 7 days after the Inflation Reduction Act had been signed into law. And if everyone remembers, we thought that was going to happen, and then it got shelved, and then all of a sudden it happened in like
Right.
a week. So the
We thought it was Build Back Better, and then
yes,
then really with the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and then, right, the Inflation Reduction Act, there was bills and the gun safety legislation, which we talked about. So there was great bills that were passed under President Biden, and that's what you're alluding to.
yeah, and the process for being a political appointee, the vetting process is quite extensive. So I say that only because I had been interviewing and being vetted for this position for a good 5 or 6 months before I got it before I started in September. And so when I was interviewing for it, IRA wasn't even, the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't even on the horizon. So it was just a little bit ironic because I got in there, and now my most of my job at Treasury, or a decent chunk of my job, was implementing that bill. And that was a very cool, I had seen legislation get crafted in Congress and then get passed. And now I was seeing it from a perspective of the executive branch having to take what Congress passed and implement it, which is a very messy process because legislation is sometimes imperfect. It's not precise with the language, and you're trying to determine, they wrote this in statute. How do we change the actual tax code? So that was, when consumers in 4 months in January of 2023 were going to be going to the car dealership and getting a tax credit for an electric vehicle, that was like a sprint. So that was one of the, again, I did not work on that legislation to craft it or to pass it, but I got to implement it and just consider. I do think that is going to be one of President Biden's sort of most signature achievements when we're looking back on his presidency in 50 or 100 years. I hope that is the first of many climate change bills that sort of set us on a better, more sustainable path, because if not, obviously that is an existential crisis.
Yeah, and I also believe that the Inflation Reduction Act what revolutionized the way that we look at healthcare. I mean, we had the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which is still going
Yeah.
strong even to this day, and that is President Obama's or former President Obama's signature domestic achievement. And then when you think about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is President Biden's one of his signature domestic achievements, and that for the first time in history, I believe that you could have the federal government negotiate with pharmaceutical companies
Yeah.
to bring down the cost of drug prices. And I think it started out with about 10 drugs or so. And then, each year it increases more and more. However, because President Trump has been trying to sadly take a sledgehammer, and we saw it in the first administration, succeeding the Obama administration, President Trump tends to want to take a sledgehammer to whatever President Obama or President Biden has implemented. We heard about repeal, replace Obamacare. Never was able to happen, thankfully.
I do think that a lot of states expanded Medicaid, which is for, the health insurance program for individuals making below a certain amount. And I believe, I mean, now we're kicking people off or we're just making it harder. And studies have shown that, when we put these restrictions on, it's not, people are getting kicked off not because they don't qualify, but just because they don't, they've got a lot of other things they're juggling and they're not able to go through all the hoops it takes to qualify. So in my view, it's short-sighted because if you agree that if you have X and Y, you should have Medicaid, then we should just let individuals have Medicaid if you make below a certain amount. But by putting all these barriers in place, it just is preventing people who qualify for receiving it. And the whole point of that was to help lift people out of poverty so that we can generate economic growth and help sort of as a country be more prosperous, and it just seems to be cutting against that. Not to not even touch on obviously, the massive tax cuts. And yes, I know everyone will get a certain amount of tax cut, but when you're a multi millionaire, that a small percentage tax cut for you is tens of thousands of dollars, whereas the average American that's making however less than 50,000 or less than 100,000, those tax cuts are minuscule in comparison. But everyone, they're able to say everyone gets a tax cut, but in reality, I mean, it is so skewed towards wealthy populations.
And what policies have mattered most to you, Kristen, in politics? Because we've touched upon, the Second Amendment, we've touched upon just now healthcare policy, we've touched upon, you know, freedom of speech, and we've also touched upon, some of President Biden's, key pieces of legislation, infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act. But what policies matter most to you, and what do you hope in the future those specific policies being more emphasized and having to really take a hard look at them to make sure that people don't take them for granted, and that if the Democrats have a blue wave next year leading up to hopefully a successful 2028 victory in the presidential race, what piece of legislation should be thought of, and what policies in general should be significantly focused on?
2 thoughts. When I was in Senator Booker's office, like, criminal justice was one of his priority issues. I was there when the First Step Act was passed, which he was a champion for that. He was an architect of that bill. It was a bipartisan bill, and it just really started to rejigger a little bit of the sort of, lock 'em up mentality in which we were, putting people behind bars for years and years and years. They had been their service, and it was just a very messed up approach to that. And That was a very and it's been years now since that passed, so I'm rusty on the merits, but it was just a really exciting, especially to see Booker, who had been working on this for his entire career in the Senate up to then, to see something, the fruits of that labor actually, like, have a positive impact on people's lives. And the second thing I would love for Dems, and I think, is economic stuff. I mean, I became a Democrat because I was a Democrat, my parents were Democrats because Democrats represented working people. They did not represent affluent, wealthy individuals. And from a monetary policy, that meant trying to ease the burden on working families, whether that's like raising the minimum wage, lowering the cost of groceries, giving a renter's credit, which is a really good idea that I think that Senator Booker has. And I think the Republican Party has this idea of trickle down economics, where if we massively give more money back to like the top 2%, they'll invest more and will create more jobs, et cetera. And that'll at some point trickle down. That hasn't worked, right? I mean, there's study after study showing over the last 30 years that that is not what contributes to like economic growth, and yet they keep promoting these policies, and unfortunately, we're losing working class voters. Like, that is, I think, is something we need to fix as a Democratic Party. And so I do think there have been some interesting ideas. Cory Booker also has the baby bonds idea. So there's a lot of, I think, I'm excited to see what other ideas come to the sort of the forefront as we start to pick up steam ahead of the next presidential election, because I do think we've got to solve where, like, fundamentally, when you look at the Democratic Party in terms of raising the minimum wage, improving protections for workers, making it easier to unionize, making it easier to access healthcare, these are all things that support working class Americans. And yet, the working class Americans at this point seem to be going in a different direction. So that's like, we've got to solve that riddle. I think there's lots of people working on it. I'm confident we will, but that's something I'm excited to sort of like, I guess, get my hands in over the next few years to figure out.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, equality, obviously, first and foremost, making sure that people are treated equally, people who come from all different walks of life and have differences of opinions, but we are as Americans, we should all be equally heard and we all should be equally respected. And we're not all of the same in terms of whom we are, in terms of like what we believe, because that's what makes us as unique individuals, like collectively as Americans. As long as you uphold the rule of law and you honor the US Constitution and you treat others with dignity and respect, and everybody is entitled to free speech and everybody's entitled to whom they can marry, or whether they want to go into business with someone or create the next successful company, or people who are our leading scientists and people who are in the health space and want to come up with different cures for cancer. I mean, everybody has different aspirations and different beliefs. So I just feel like we all need to be accepted as human beings and treat other people with dignity and respect. If it wasn't for, policies in the Obama administration or policies in the Biden administration, even going back to the Clinton years too, I really believe that our country would not be as advanced as it is now. And then now we just have to figure out, to your point about the economy, because the economy is not doing so well, and really unemployment rates higher. Only 22,000 jobs were created in the month of August, and whether or not the labor market was slowing down or the economy was, losing steam toward the end of the Biden years, still over 16 million jobs were created. And whether you want to consider them to be recovery jobs or bounce back jobs from COVID, opposed to which ones were actually newly created, it's still 16 million jobs nonetheless. And getting out of supply chain disruption, getting out of the, having to weather the storm of inflation increases because President Biden had to give more stimulus to Americans who were still reeling from a once in a 100-year pandemic. And then because of our immigration system being broken, because of our political discourse at a national level, local and state too, broken, I feel like politics, unfortunately, the political landscape, communication is broken. So we, as citizens of this country, and whether you're in politics or not, you could be business leaders, community leaders, you could be people who have access to people like you who are tied to politics. We just have to be patient enough and listen to each other and understand each other to do good and to do great work and to get back to a better place and protect one another and protect each other. And I really pray and hope that, given that what has occurred this week, that it doesn't get worse and that we have to get back to our what our founding fathers envisioned: a civilized democracy, a civilized society where there's three co-equal branches of government and one branch doesn't usurp the other or overstep, overreach. And we're not a country of a king and queen. We're a country where you have duly elected officials. We just have to get to a better place where, we're seen and heard, and it's in a respectful, orderly fashion where everybody, upholds the rule of law. You have any final words of wisdom of what you believe is important about relationship building and team environment? And if you want to touch upon real quick your current company and what goals you have set for yourself, in the next few years.
Yeah, sure. So a couple, yeah, quick thoughts on the relationship piece. I meant to mention this earlier when you were chatting about it, but my first, I think I call it like breakthrough when I went to work for Senator Bennett, out in Colorado. Like it was through a relationship because I had worked at Colorado College for many years before that, and the person I worked for at Colorado College, her name is Jacqueline Lundquist. She was the wife of the president of Colorado College, and I got to know her through relationships because I was coaching the basketball team, like, as an assistant coach before I got this job, and I met her at an athletics banquet, and we formed a relationship, and then she had this job at CC, so I went to work for her, and lo and behold, it turns out she knew Michael Bennett, and so 5 years later, when I was applying for that job, I, of course, said, "Hey, Jacqueline, can you put in a good word?" And so those relationships, it's never going to be, oh, you get this job, but it is going in industries like politics where there's a lot of people trying to get in. It does help. It helped that I had this relationship. And again, I wasn't forming that relationship because of what it was going to get me in the future. I was forming that relationship because I was working closely with her and she was a fantastic mentor in my life. But it was able, I'm very confident that had I just applied for that job with nobody saying, "Hey, can look at this candidate. I think she's got a strong resume. Just take a look at her resume," right? That's all it takes. And then from there, of course, you need to take it the rest of the way. So I want to make sure I mention that because that just keeps at the foundation of relationships. And then also just speaking of relationships is I had my firm KCL strategies just a few months ago. I launched with three friends of mine and colleagues from the Biden admin, Pinnacle Public Affairs. So that also goes back to relationships. One of my partners I've worked with going back to the 2016 Hillary campaign in Colorado. His name's Han. So my LinkedIn is a little bit outdated because I'm not on there as often as I should be, but that's been super exciting. We're sort of a boutique public affairs firm serving sort of mission driven clients and working at the intersection of sort of making change and handling crisis communications and executive communications and all that sort of stuff. So it's definitely different than working in politics or working in government, but it's a nice change of pace, and I'm kind of excited to be, yeah, doing my own thing and seeing what the road ahead is.
Well, that's wonderful, Chris. And I really want to thank you for being with me today and
Yeah.
having this candid, insightful conversation. We touch upon a lot of topics. I look forward to our interview airing. Again, for my audience at home, Kristin Lynch, my 86th guest on the Wave Capital's guest speaker series on relationship building and team environment, someone who has worked for Booker and Polis and Hickenlooper and the Bidens. I mean, it just speaks to what an incredible resume you have, and not only in the public sector but now the private sector, and the fact that you are such a bright light in the Democratic Party because you're someone who, because of your experiences in politics in various capacities, looking into the future, you'll be able to be really instrumental and be another key voice for the Democratic Party as we look to the midterms next year. And, wishing you all the best and wonderful success. Look forward to staying in touch and having many more conversations in the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing what, in terms of after the midterms and a future Democratic White House, hopefully you'll get to be a part of that if that's what you aspire to, because of your great work that you've done in the past and the great work that you're currently doing with your firm and partnering with previous Biden officials. But thank you again for your time, Kristen. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for reaching out and having me on. I enjoyed our discussion, and congrats. I mean, 86, that's 86 guests, that's a lot. So congrats on, keeping these things going and having these conversations because I think they're helpful.
If you think of anyone who would love to be on my show to have similar conversations like you and I have had, I'd be more than happy to welcome them. And please, share our interview when it airs with your professional network. And I'll be doing the same with my network. But I hope you have a great weekend and I look forward to
Thanks.
talking to you soon.
Yeah. Take care. Bye, Garrett. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.